The whispers followed me as I walked through the apartment complex. Have you heard about Luna? She just got a 3-bedroom apartment. Some people have all the luck in the world. The words stung as I quietly closed the courtyard gate behind me, trying to shut out their envious chatter. The housing market in our city had grown by 45% in the last year alone, making any apartment purchase a significant achievement. With quick steps, I made my way to Ryan's room, my heart beating fast in my chest. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as I carefully opened his desk drawer. There, hidden inside an old mooncake tin decorated with faded flowers, lay my savings, exactly $900. I counted the bills 3 times, remembering how, in my previous life, Emma had turned this same amount into a fortune through clever property investment. This time would be different. Instead of staying here and watching history repeat itself, I planned to take my savings and travel south, where housing prices were 30% lower than in our city. The statistics showed that smaller cities were growing faster, with better opportunities for newcomers. The wedding date Ryan and I had chosen, the 18th of next month according to the lunar calendar, would pass without celebration. Just as I was about to leave, voices outside the door made me freeze. I quickly slipped into my room, leaving the door slightly open. The conversation that followed shattered my remaining doubts about my decision. "Ryan, are you really giving me your apartment buying quota?" Emma's voice was filled with joy and disbelief. In our city's tight housing market, only 15% of residents qualified for the special purchasing quota each year, making it as valuable as gold. Through the crack in the door, I watched Ryan's face soften in a way it never did when he looked at me. "You and your son need this more than I do," he said gently. The government's recent housing report showed that single mothers like Emma spent an average of 60% of their income on housing, compared to 35% for other households. This wasn't just about an apartment, it was about security for her family. Emma's voice trembled as she continued. "But even with the quota, I can't afford it. You know how hard it is raising a child alone." She explained how her part-time jobs barely covered their basic needs, with childcare costs taking up nearly 40% of her monthly income. The silence that followed felt heavy until Ryan spoke again. "I'll help with the money. Don't worry about it." Their footsteps faded away after Emma's grateful thanks. Standing alone in my room afterward, I remembered my past life, when Emma had sold that apartment for a profit of $200,000 5 years after buying it. The property market had boomed, with average home values increasing by 150% in that area. Back then, Ryan had dismissed my jealousy with a cold, "It's just fate." Now I understood. It wasn't fate at all. It was his choice, one that he'd made in both timelines. Touching the money hidden in my pocket, I knew my choice was clear too. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away and write your own story. For years, I had blindly accepted Ryan's explanation that Emma's success was just luck. Looking back now, I felt foolish for not seeing the truth sooner. A recent study showed that 65% of people attribute others' success to luck rather than investigating deeper causes. In my case, the truth had been carefully hidden until Emma accidentally revealed it in my previous life. Ryan had orchestrated her fortune all along. The depth of Ryan's feelings for Emma became crystal clear as I thought about our living situation. We were squeezed into a tiny 300-square-foot apartment, barely enough space for 3 people according to housing standards, which recommend at least 200 square feet per person. Yet here he was, secretly channeling his resources to provide Emma with a better life. The irony of him telling me, "It's just fate," while actively shaping that fate behind my back made my stomach turn. After they left, I sat in the quiet room until the sun began to set, watching shadows stretch across the walls. My mind was made up. I retrieved the old mooncake tin from Ryan's room and placed it on our dining table. That evening, I cooked myself a proper meal: chicken soup that filled the house with its aroma and a large pot of steaming rice. The apartment felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath for what would come next. Opening the tin revealed more than just my savings. Hidden beneath my $900 lay Ryan's careful stash of $2,600, 2 years of his savings based on the average salary at his research institute, which typically allowed employees to save about $108 per month. There were also important documents: his workplace housing certificate and a neat stack of expense receipts, each one telling its own story of calculated decisions. When Ryan came home and saw the open tin, his handsome face darkened with a frown. "What are you doing with that?" he demanded. In my previous life, I would have greeted him with an eager smile, proud to be engaged to such an accomplished man. At 6'2", with a prestigious university degree and a position at a well-known research institute, Ryan had seemed like the perfect catch. Statistics showed that only 12% of men in our city held both the advanced degree and a stable government job. But now I saw past the impressive exterior to the truth beneath. I calmly explained about my father's loans, watching Ryan's face carefully. My father, a dedicated middle school teacher for 30 years, had earned just enough to support us after my mother's early passing. The average teacher's salary in those days was barely sufficient for basic needs, with 40% going to housing and 30% to food and utilities. Despite this, my father had helped countless students, including Ryan, with free tutoring and financial support. Data showed that teachers like my father often spent 15 to 20% of their personal income helping struggling students. Ryan's expression didn't change when I mentioned the loans. "How much is still owed?" he asked after a moment's pause. The steadiness in his voice revealed nothing of our shared history, how my father had covered his high school tuition when his family struggled, or the countless times he'd slipped Ryan pocket money. A recent study found that 72% of people who receive significant help in their youth feel obligated to repay it later in life, but Ryan seemed unmoved by this moral debt. The average high school tuition back then was equivalent to 3 months of a teacher's salary, making my father's assistance even more significant. $3,100, I said calmly, watching Ryan's face change. His eyes widened slightly. The amount was significant, representing about 4 months of an average worker's salary in our area. When he questioned the sum, I pretended to reach for the IOUs tucked away in the tin. A study on personal lending showed that 85% of informal loans between colleagues were documented with handwritten IOUs, a practice my father had wisely followed. Ryan quickly stopped me, saying he trusted my word. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, he asked if we could delay the repayment. I knew exactly why he wanted to wait. The money was meant for Emma's apartment down payment. According to recent real estate data, a typical down payment in our city required at least $2,500, and housing prices were rising by 3% every month. The irony of the situation almost made me laugh. While I was planning my escape south, where living costs were 40% lower, he was plotting to give away money that wasn't even rightfully his. After Ryan left, I pulled out my father's old account book, its pages worn and filled with careful notes in his neat handwriting. Teachers like my father typically earned 30% less than other professionals with similar education levels, making his generosity even more remarkable. The book documented every expense, each entry a testament to his kindness. Studies showed that only 8% of people kept such detailed financial records in those days, but my father never missed an entry. The final tally shocked me. Ryan's education expenses alone totaled over $2,800. To put this in perspective, the average teacher in those years earned roughly $900 annually. My father had given away 3 years' worth of salary to help Ryan, not counting what he spent on basic living expenses. According to education statistics from that period, high school tuition and living costs consumed about 65% of an average family's annual income. I took exactly $2,800 from Ryan's savings, leaving the remaining $200 as a sort of interest foregone. Financial experts often recommend documenting such transactions, so I made careful notes of my calculations. The next morning, while I was preparing breakfast, the simple rice porridge that cost just 50 cents to make, I heard Emma's voice outside. Her sobbing cut through the quiet morning air. "They're so cruel. How could they hit you?" she cried. Recent studies showed that domestic violence reports had increased by 25% in our neighborhood over the past year. But this was the first time I'd heard about Emma being affected. I stepped out of the kitchen to find Emma practically melting into Ryan's arms, looking small and vulnerable. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her long hair falling messily over her shoulders. Statistics showed that victims of abuse often turn to friends rather than authorities, with 70% seeking help from their closest confidants first. When I asked what was happening, Emma quickly tried to compose herself, wiping away tears with trembling hands. "Don't misunderstand, Luna," she said softly. "I just needed to talk to Ryan." The three of us had grown up together in this neighborhood, back when most houses were simple wooden structures packed closely together. A community survey from that time showed that 80% of childhood friendships formed in such close-knit neighborhoods lasted into adulthood. Ryan and Emma had lived in the same courtyard, their families sharing the kind of proximity that often bred either deep friendship or bitter rivalry. In their case, it had clearly led to something more, though I'd been too blind to see it until now. Recent research indicated that childhood friends who later developed romantic feelings had a 45% higher chance of maintaining long-term connections than couples who met as adults. The Great Fire that swept through our neighborhood 10 years ago marked a turning point in all our lives. While miraculously no one died, the disaster destroyed homes across several streets, causing an estimated $500,000 in damage. Fire safety records show that wooden houses, which made up 75% of the buildings in our area, were particularly vulnerable. After the rebuilding period, families scattered to different locations, forever changing the close-knit community we once knew. Housing statistics from that era reveal that only 30% of original residents returned to rebuild in the same location. Emma's life took a particularly tragic turn when she married a tailor's apprentice. Statistics showed that craftsmen like tailors earned modest incomes, averaging $800 annually. Her happiness was short-lived. She became a widow shortly after the marriage, joining the 15% of women in our city who had lost their spouses before age 30. Mental health studies from that time indicated that young widows faced a 60% higher risk of severe depression. It was Ryan who helped her return to her family home, though I now realized his assistance went far beyond mere friendship. When Ryan mentioned Emma living under someone else's roof, he was referring to her difficult situation with her sister-in-law. According to family counselors, living with in-laws after becoming widowed often led to conflicts, with 70% of such arrangements resulting in regular disagreements. Emma would run to Ryan whenever these conflicts arose, and he would invariably solve her problems. Looking back at my previous life, I felt foolish for believing their relationship was purely sibling-like. Studies showed that childhood friends who maintained close bonds into adulthood often harbored deeper feelings, with 45% of such relationships having romantic undertones. "Ryan's about to get married," I said coldly, watching Emma still wrapped in his embrace. "Your behavior is inappropriate. People might think you're planning to remarry." Social statistics from our community showed that only 25% of widows remarried, and those who did often faced harsh judgment. Even though I had no intention of following through with my engagement to Ryan, I couldn't resist pointing out this social taboo. Emma's face instantly changed, and she looked to Ryan for support, just as she always did. Ryan frowned and scolded me for my nonsense, but I merely sneered and returned to the kitchen. Through the thin walls, I could hear Emma's continued crying and Ryan's soft words of comfort. A recent study on emotional support showed that people tend to seek comfort from those they trust most, with 80% of individuals having one primary confidant. In Emma's case, that person had always been Ryan, despite his engagement to me. After breakfast, I headed to my job as a quality inspector at the local factory. This position, which I'd held since graduating high school, paid a steady salary of $1,100 annually, above the national average for similar roles. However, I knew from my previous life that economic troubles loomed ahead. Market analysis predicted a 30% decline in manufacturing jobs over the next 5 years, with quality control positions being particularly vulnerable. The factory's profit margins were already dropping by 5% each quarter, though most employees remained unaware of the impending crisis. I planned to sell my job quota while it still held value. These positions were coveted, with transfer rights worth up to $3,000 in the current market. Economic research showed that during the reform period, early risk takers had a 65% higher chance of achieving financial success. Walking home from work, I passed the empty field where Emma's future apartment would stand. Currently overgrown with weeds, property records indicated this land would soon be developed into luxury apartments, with values expected to triple within 5 years. In my previous life, becoming a 10,000-aire, someone worth $10,000, was a significant achievement, reached by only 5% of the population during those transformative years. The empty field wouldn't stay that way for long. According to urban development plans, within 3 years, it would transform into luxury high-rises, each tower stretching at least 30 stories into the sky. Real estate projections showed property values in this area would increase by 500% over the next decade. While Emma had secured her future here in my previous life, this time would be different. Without Ryan's financial support, she would have no claim to this golden opportunity. Market analysis showed that early investors in such developments typically saw returns of 300 to 400% on their initial investment. When I arrived home that evening, I found Ryan in our kitchen, an unusual sight since he spent less than 2% of his time there according to our normal routine. He had prepared an elaborate meal, something that happened about as often as a solar eclipse. "Go wash up. Dinner's almost ready," he said, trying to sound casual. I didn't object to someone else cooking, especially since the average home-cooked meal took 45 minutes to prepare and usually fell to me. The dinner spread was impressive by our standards, featuring meat dishes that cost roughly 20% of our weekly food budget, fresh vegetables from the market, and even fish, a luxury item that typically costs 3 times more than regular meat. But I knew expensive meals often came with hidden costs. Studies showed that 85% of special meals prepared by partners were preludes to difficult conversations. Ryan's hesitant expression confirmed my suspicions, though I pretended not to notice, keeping my head down and focusing on my food. Before Ryan could gather his courage to speak, Emma appeared at our door. The evening wind had picked up to 15 mph, according to the weather report, and Ryan, showing his usual favoritism, quickly invited her in and served her hot tea. Emma's face glowed with happiness as she turned to me. "Thank you so much for agreeing to let me have the housing quota and even lending money for the apartment." Her words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. I looked at her with carefully crafted confusion. What quota? What housing quota? The atmosphere in the room dropped by several degrees. Emma's smile faltered, her expression shifting from joy to unease in the span of a heartbeat. Social psychology studies suggest that unexpected confrontations cause visible physical reactions within 0.2 seconds. Emma stood up nervously, looking to Ryan for support, her usual pattern when faced with conflict. "Ryan," she stammered, "does your fiancé not know about the quota?" Emma's eyes gleamed with what market researchers would call competitive satisfaction, the pleasure of gaining advantage over a rival. Yet her voice maintained its apologetic tone. "Oh dear, Ryan, I know you care about my son and me, but such important decisions should involve your future wife." Statistics showed that 67% of relationship conflicts arose from financial decisions made without mutual consultation. "I've said too much," she added, backing toward the door. "Goodbye, Ryan. Goodbye, Luna." Ryan's soft response to Emma, "It's fine, it's my decision," spoke volumes about our relationship's power dynamics. After she left, I continued eating in silence, maintaining my heart rate at a steady 70 beats per minute despite my inner turmoil. I finished every bite of the meal that had cost approximately 15% of our monthly food budget. Only when I stood to leave did Ryan finally speak up. "Luna, can we talk?" According to relationship experts, 90% of serious conversations that begin this way lead to significant life changes. I sat back down, my face as expressionless as a blank canvas, ready to hear what he had to say. When Ryan asked to delay repaying the money, I cut him off with a firm no. Financial advisors say that 75% of relationship conflicts stem from money matters, but this wasn't just about money, it was about respect. The money sat safely in my possession now, and I had no intention of letting it become another resource drained away by Emma's endless needs. Studies show that enabling behavior often creates a cycle of dependency, with the average enabler spending 40% of their disposable income supporting others. "Let's talk about this housing quota," I said sharply, feeling my blood pressure rise. "You gave away something this valuable without even mentioning it to me?" While technically the quota belonged to Ryan, his secret decision affected our shared future. Housing quotas were precious in our city. Only 20% of residents qualified for them each year, and they could reduce property costs by up to 30%. In my previous life, Ryan had not only given away the quota, but had also funneled my salary to Emma, treating my earnings like his personal charity fund. The truth hit me hard. In Ryan's eyes, I ranked lower than a blade of grass in his priorities. Recent psychological studies suggest that people who consistently prioritize others over their partners often have unresolved emotional attachments. Ryan defended himself, saying, "The quota is useless to us right now. Emma needs it more. She's living under her sister-in-law's control with her son. How can you be so heartless?" Statistics showed that single mothers faced housing difficulties at 3 times the rate of other families. But that didn't justify his actions. "It's just a quota, and it's not even yours. Why are you making such a big deal about this?" he added dismissively. I nodded slowly, a bitter smile forming on my face. "You're right. It's not mine. Give it to whoever you want." According to relationship experts, such passive responses often mask deep-seated resentment, with 80% of couples reporting that dismissive attitudes cause long-term damage to their relationships. Just when I thought the conversation was over, Ryan made his real intentions clear. "Emma can't wait," he said, reaching out his hand expectantly. "Give me the money, and I'll send it to her." His casual demand for the money, equivalent to roughly 6 months of average salary, showed how normalized his behavior had become. When I brought out the mooncake tin, his eyes lit up with hope that quickly died when he found only receipts and my father's detailed account book inside. Confusion crossed his face as he flipped through the pages. The account book documented every expense my father had incurred on Ryan's behalf, with the kind of detailed record-keeping that accountants say only 5% of people maintain. Each entry told its own story. School fees that cost 40% of my father's monthly salary, textbooks worth 2 weeks' wages, living expenses that added up to thousands over the years. By the time Ryan reached the final page, his expression had turned dark with understanding. "What is this?" he demanded. I calmly pulled out my own notebook, where I had calculated every penny my father had invested in Ryan's future. The total came to over $1,800, equivalent to 3 years of an average teacher's salary in those days. When Ryan asked if I expected him to repay it, I simply nodded. Financial records showed that education costs in that era consumed up to 70% of a family's annual income, making my father's sacrifice even more significant. "Think what you want," I told him firmly, "but this money will not go to Emma." Studies on financial boundaries indicate that clear, firm statements like this successfully prevent future financial abuse in 85% of cases. Looking directly at Ryan, I pointed out the remaining debt of $200. Initially, I considered letting this small amount go, but now I want every penny back. According to financial experts, small debts often cause the most friction in relationships, with amounts under $500 leading to 45% of monetary disputes. My father is gone, and I won't let people whisper about how he was taken advantage of. Ryan stared at me as if seeing a stranger, clearly shocked by my detailed accounting. "I can't believe you're counting every cent," he said, his voice filled with disappointment. I responded with an icy smile. "Don't they say clear accounts make good friends?" This old saying, according to business relationship studies, remains true in 90% of cases where financial matters are involved. Ryan fell silent, then spoke in a low voice that carried a clear threat. "Luna, I never thought you'd be so calculating. Are you sure you still want to go through with next month's wedding?" Memories flooded back as I fought to hold back my tears. Ryan had always shown such respect to my father, maintaining a perfect image that would have impressed any parent. Statistics show that 85% of parents value respect and career success most highly in potential sons-in-law. After securing a good job, he had promised my dying father 2 years ago that he would take care of me forever. Research indicates that deathbed promises carry powerful emotional weight, with 95% of people feeling strongly obligated to keep them. My feelings for Ryan had grown naturally, especially during the dark days following my father's death. Grief counselors note that emotional support during bereavement often leads to deep attachment, with 70% of people reporting stronger bonds with those who help them through loss. But now, here he was, threatening our relationship for Emma's sake. The irony made me laugh bitterly. Did he really think I couldn't survive without him? "If you want to cancel the wedding, that's perfectly fine with me," I said calmly, watching his face freeze in surprise. Before he could recover, I continued with a smile. "But if you're so worried about Emma, there might be a better way to help her than buying a house. Money isn't always the answer. Studies show that financial assistance alone solves only 35% of long-term stability issues for single parents." I explained my proposal. Her sister-in-law treats her badly because she sees Emma as dependent. If I give Emma my job, she'll have both steady income and childcare benefits. Employment statistics showed that stable jobs with childcare benefits increased single mothers' financial independence by 80%. Ryan's face showed confusion as he tried to understand my suggestion. Factory jobs like mine were valuable, offering benefits worth approximately 40% of the base salary. "Don't think I'm being generous," I added calmly. "You can trade your housing quota for my job." After 2 days of consideration, Ryan agreed to the arrangement. The solution worked better than expected. Emma gained a stable position paying $1,200 annually, with benefits covering 70% of childcare costs. Her improved financial status helped resolve the tensions at home, and her happiness seemed genuine. Social workers confirm that financial independence resolves family conflicts in 75% of cases involving widowed individuals living with in-laws. Ryan appeared satisfied too, though he couldn't have known I was already planning my departure south, where new opportunities awaited. The moment I got my housing allocation, I didn't waste any time. I took the $1,000 and bought the property right away. The idea that this small amount could grow into millions made my heart race with excitement. Ryan, my fiancé, thought I had given my work responsibilities to Emma just to focus on our wedding plans for next month. He had no clue that I had already bought a train ticket heading south, planning to leave the very next day. That evening when Ryan came home, I was just finishing up my packing. He noticed all the bags and boxes since there was no dinner ready on the table. "What's with all the packing?" he asked, looking confused. Instead of waiting for an answer, he went to the kitchen and started cooking. He made a simple dinner, just 3 basic dishes and a bowl of soup. I quickly shoved my packed bags into the closet and told him, Oh, I'm just cleaning up and organizing my things. There's too much stuff lying around. Ryan brought me some hot soup and then pulled out some money from his pocket. He seemed a bit nervous as he explained, I just lent Emma 50 since she's starting her new job. Here's 30 for you. I only paused for a moment before taking the money. Even though he had given the bigger amount to someone else, I didn't feel bad taking it since it was money he actually owed to my father anyway. We sat through a very quiet dinner. Neither of us said much, just the sound of chopsticks and bowls filling the silence. Ryan kept looking at me, clearing his throat several times before finally speaking. Don't worry, he said softly, his face getting red. After we're married, you can stay home and take care of the house. I'll give you my whole salary every month. You'll be in charge of our money. He looked at me with such hope in his eyes, something I rarely saw from him. I couldn't help but let out a small laugh. What about next month? I asked sharply. Won't you need to give your sister more money again? Ryan looked completely confused by my question. Why would I need to? He asked. She has a job now. I didn't know what to say back, but it didn't really matter anymore. Once I was gone, whatever happened between Ryan and Emma, or if he married someone else, none of it would be my problem anymore. Later that night, Ryan brought out a big stack of bright red wedding invitations. He wanted to go through the guest list with me, but I could barely look at those red cards. You decide, I said coldly, before going to my room and locking the door behind me. I hadn't packed much, just 2 changes of clothes. I had carefully sewn most of my money and valuable things into the collars and cuffs of my clothes. The rest was hidden inside my socks. I figured smelly money was better than no money when I reached where I was going. I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard Ryan knocking on my door. Feeling irritated, I got up to open it. There he stood in the hallway, holding a shiny wooden box in his hands. The sight of him standing there, looking so earnest with that box, almost made me feel guilty about what I was planning. But I had made up my mind. Tomorrow would be the start of my new life, far away from here, far away from Ryan and all his family drama. I stood in the living room, staring at the small wooden box Thomas held out to me. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. "What's that?" I asked, taking a small step backward when he moved to hand it to me. Something about his eager expression made me nervous, bringing back memories I'd rather forget. Thomas noticed my hesitation and carefully set the box down on the coffee table between us. His eyes never left my face as I slowly reached for it, my fingers tracing the smooth wooden edges before lifting the lid. Inside, nestled on dark velvet, lay several pieces of jewelry that made my heart skip a beat. A beautiful jade bracelet, 2 golden rings that caught the sunlight, and a pair of delicate silver bracelets. My stomach twisted as I remembered finding these exact same pieces in his study years from now, in what felt like another lifetime. Back then, he had slammed the box shut and told me sharply that these were family heirlooms meant for his future daughter-in-law. Yet somehow, the jade bracelet had ended up with Sarah just months later. The memories felt like tiny needles pricking at my skin. In my past life, I had never understood why these precious family treasures had been kept from me, his wife and the mother of his child, only to be given to Sarah. Now, standing here in this moment, everything was different. Thomas was offering them to me freely, his face full of hope and something that looked almost like love. But I couldn't help wondering if this gesture had anything to do with my recent decision to step aside at work, letting Sarah take my position at the company. Thomas reached for the jade bracelet, his cheeks slightly pink. "Here, let me put this on you," he said softly, moving closer. The gentleness in his voice almost made me forget the pain of my past life, but I couldn't let myself be fooled again. I pulled my hand away before he could touch me, watching as confusion and hurt flashed across his face. "We're not married yet," I said, my voice steady and cool. "It wouldn't be right for me to accept these now. The silence that followed felt heavy and thick. Thomas stood completely still, staring at me like he was seeing a stranger. I knew what he was thinking. In the past, I would have been overjoyed at such a gesture. The old me would have cried happy tears at being offered these precious family heirlooms. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who had lived through years of disappointment and heartbreak. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Is something wrong? You seem different lately." I looked at him calmly, remembering all the nights I had spent wondering what I had done wrong, why I had never been good enough. "Nothing's wrong," I replied, my voice empty of emotion. "I just don't care about these things anymore." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked to my room, closing the door firmly behind me. Through the thin walls, I could hear him pacing the hallway for hours, his footsteps a constant reminder of everything that had changed. The next morning, I woke up early to find the house silent and empty. Thomas had already left for work, probably unable to face another uncomfortable conversation. I packed my bags quickly, not allowing myself to think too much about what I was doing. An hour later, I was sitting on the old green train heading south, watching the city slowly disappear behind me. As the familiar landscape rolled past my window, I finally let myself cry, not for the jewelry or the man I was leaving behind, but for the woman I used to be, who had wanted those things so desperately. The train ride seemed to go on forever, stretching across 2 long days and 1 sleepless night. I found myself squeezed into a hard seat by the window, surrounded by travelers of all kinds, mothers with crying babies, workers heading home, and students chatting loudly. Every few hours, the train would stop at small stations, where local sellers would rush up to the windows with baskets full of fresh fruit, hot meals, and snacks. Though the smell of the boxed lunches made my stomach growl, I knew I needed to save every penny I had. Instead, I bought cheap steamed buns and handfuls of roasted peanuts from the old women who walked along the platform, their voices calling out prices into the warm air. Most passengers came and went, but I stayed glued to my seat, only getting up when I absolutely had to use the bathroom. I kept my bag close, wrapped around my legs while I slept in awkward positions. When I finally arrived at North City Station, tired and stiff from the long journey, I discovered something that made my heart sink. Someone had cut open my bag and the pockets of my clothes while I was sleeping. I allowed myself a small smile, though, thinking about the clever trick I'd used, keeping only a few small bills in those obvious spots, with my real money hidden safely away in a secret pocket I'd sewn into my underwear. The area around the station was like a maze of danger. Men kept approaching me, trying to pull me toward shabby-looking hotels, promising cheap rooms but giving me bad feelings about their true intentions. I held my damaged bag close to my chest and walked quickly, ignoring their calls and whistles. With nowhere else to go, I found myself in a hospital nearby, sitting in a quiet corner of the hallway where I could rest without being bothered. The next morning, my luck changed when a kind security guard pointed me toward a neighborhood where I could rent a small room from a local family. It wasn't much, but it was safe and clean, and that's all I needed to start my new life. I found work at a big wholesale market, starting as a simple shop helper. Everything was new to me at first. The long hours standing on my feet, the endless rows of clothing racks, the rapid-fire questions from customers. But I watched everything carefully and learned quickly. I figured out how to help the big buyers who came looking for large orders, memorized where everything was stored, and mastered the art of keeping track of what went in and out of the shop. After just 2 months, I could handle any customer's request without breaking a sweat, matching them with exactly what they needed from our massive inventory. As I worked, I started noticing patterns in how the market operated. Every shop around us sold similar things, rows and rows of clothes, shoes, and accessories. When popular items came in, they would sell out in the blink of an eye, leaving customers frustrated and shop owners scrambling to get more. But then there were times when shops would buy too much of something, hoping it would sell well, only to watch it sit on the shelves gathering dust. My own boss faced this problem all the time, ordering huge amounts of stock that sometimes just wouldn't move. What looked like a successful business from the outside often told a different story behind closed doors. I watched as shop after shop dealt with the same issue, making what seemed like good money on paper, but ending up with so much leftover stock that their actual profits were tiny, or sometimes none at all. By the time the year was ending, many shops were practically giving away items just to clear space for new stock. I spent countless hours watching this cycle repeat, and slowly, an idea started forming in my mind. After a year of careful saving, putting aside every extra penny from my wages and the small amount I'd brought with me, I finally had enough money to make my move. The timing couldn't have been better. South City and the coastal areas were growing quickly, with people there hungry for fashionable clothes and willing to pay good money for them. I went to my boss with a carefully planned proposal. I would buy all the leftover stock that had been sitting in the storage room, taking it off their hands at a much lower price. As I made my pitch, I could already see the possibilities unfolding, how these unwanted items could become exactly what the growing coastal markets were looking for. Living in our inland city was quite different from the bustling coastal areas. We were way behind when it came to fashion and new trends, mainly because we were so far from everything. The roads weren't great, and it took forever for anything new to reach us. I knew that if I could be the first person to bring trendy clothes to our city, I could make good money. Everyone was hungry for stylish things to wear, but nobody had easy access to them. Getting the clothes was just the beginning of my challenge. I spent almost a week going from one shipping company to another, trying to find someone who could deliver to our small city. Most of them just shook their heads and said it wasn't possible. I was about to give up when I finally found a company that was willing to help. They weren't excited about it, but after I offered them an extra $300, they agreed to add our city to their delivery route. It wasn't cheap, but I knew it would be worth it. The journey home was much more difficult than my trip there. The trains were packed with people heading home for the New Year celebrations, and finding a seat was like trying to win a battle. I had changed during my time away, though. When an old lady tried to argue with me about my seat, I stayed calm. Even when someone cut my bag and stole it, I didn't panic like I would have before. These problems seemed small compared to what I had already overcome. After arriving home, I rented a small shop space on the ground floor of a busy street. It wasn't fancy, but it was in a perfect spot where lots of people walked by every day. I hired a man with a tricycle to help me bring all my goods from the delivery station to my new shop. It took several trips, but finally, everything was in place. I set up my stall where everyone could see the clothes easily. My year of working in North City had taught me a lot about different types of customers. I learned that everyone shops differently, and you need to treat each person in a special way. For my wealthy customers, I would carefully show them the best quality items and explain how well they were made. When picky customers came in, I would patiently let them try on as many things as they wanted. The bargain hunters were my favorite. I always kept extra socks and gloves handy, offering them as free gifts when they bought multiple items. This strategy worked perfectly, and they usually ended up buying more than they planned. As the new year got closer, my business really took off. People were excited to have new, fashionable clothes available in our city. I noticed other shop owners walking by slowly, trying to figure out what I was selling and why I was doing so well. It made me proud to see how popular my items had become. By the time I sold everything, all the clothes, scarves, socks, and hair accessories, I had made almost $10,000. It was more money than I had ever seen before, and I could hardly believe my success. After the New Year celebrations, I made a smart decision not to rush into buying new stock right away. I knew from experience that people don't buy many clothes right after the holidays. They've usually spent all their money on celebrations and gifts. Instead of rushing to get more inventory that might not sell, I decided to use my profits wisely. I took the money I had earned and invested in 5 more properties in the same building complex where I had bought my first one. Real estate seemed like a safer bet during the quiet season, and I knew the value of these properties would only go up over time. In the early days after moving to South City, I started my business selling basic home appliances from a small cart. I noticed that many young couples getting married were looking for what people called the 4 must-haves: a bicycle, sewing machine, watch, and radio. This gave me an idea for what to sell. I focused mainly on radios since they were becoming very popular but were hard to find in our area. Many families wanted one, but the supply was limited. I spent long hours learning about different radio models and building relationships with suppliers. Even though I sold cheaper brands than the famous ones, people still bought them because they worked well and were more affordable. The business grew quickly over the summer months. By August, I had saved enough money from my sales to buy a large shipment of radios and other electronics. The timing was perfect. When the goods arrived, they sold even faster than I expected. Each radio gave me a good profit, and I also started selling things like cassette tapes, which brought in steady money. Fall turned out to be the busiest season. September and October were especially good months for sales, as many people were buying gifts for weddings and preparing for the year-end celebrations. I made several trips to restock my inventory, and each time I returned with more goods, they would sell out quickly. The wedding season and New Year festival brought in so many customers that I could hardly keep up with demand. As time went on, I got better at running the business. I built strong connections with suppliers in South City, which made things much easier. Instead of traveling there every time I needed more stock, I could just make a phone call and send money. The suppliers would deliver everything right to my door within a few days. This saved me a lot of time and helped me focus on serving customers. My little street cart business had grown too big for the sidewalk. I decided to rent a large shop with 3 connected units in the busiest shopping area of town. I also rented a big storage room nearby where I could store products for my new wholesale business. While I made less money per item selling wholesale, I could sell much more at once, which meant better overall profits. Soon, I hired 3 people to help me with sales while I worked on finding ways to make the business even bigger. One day, while I was working in the shop, I heard a sad conversation that caught my attention. A woman named Emma was standing at the entrance with her young son, crying as she talked to her husband Ryan. "We don't need a big wedding party," she was saying, "but won't you at least buy me a sewing machine?" Her voice was filled with hurt and disappointment as she looked at her husband, waiting for his answer. 2 years had slipped away like sand through an hourglass. I spotted Ryan across the store, and my heart skipped a beat. He wasn't the same person I remembered. The confident, well-dressed man who used to command attention wherever he went now looked tired and worn down. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his once perfect black hair was streaked with early gray. When he caught me looking at him, he stopped dead in his tracks, his face going pale. "Luna," he whispered, so quietly I could barely hear him. Emma noticed Ryan's reaction and turned to see what had caught his attention. When she saw me, her eyes widened for a moment before she quickly looked away. But then something changed in her expression. A sort of determination came over her face, and she stood up straighter, putting on an air of importance. "Luna, what a surprise! Do you work here now?" she asked loudly, making sure everyone could hear. One of my employees started to say something but stopped when they saw the warning look on my face. Emma seemed to realize she'd shown too much of her true feelings. She forced her face into a pleasant smile and grabbed Ryan's arm, which felt stiff as a board under her grip. As they walked toward me, she casually ran her fingers through her hair, trying to appear relaxed. "It's been such a long time, Luna," she said sweetly. I gave her a small smile and replied, "Just doing some shopping?" Ryan looked like he wanted to speak. His eyes were red and his mouth kept opening and closing, but no words came out. Emma shot him an angry look before turning back to me with another fake smile. "Oh, Luna, I should tell you. Ryan and I are married now," Emma announced, her voice dripping with satisfaction. I nodded politely and said, "Congratulations. I guess you're shopping for things for your home?" Emma gave a small nod, clearly pleased with herself, and then started pulling me around the store like we were old friends. I played along, complimenting her choices and acting impressed as she picked out expensive items: a fancy radio, a top-of-the-line sewing machine, and the most expensive color TV we had in stock. To make this little reunion extra special, I quietly added an extra $1,000 to the TV's price. When it came time to pay, Ryan's face turned dark as he looked at the total, but Emma couldn't stop smiling. As they got ready to leave, Emma turned to me with a smug look. "Thank you for all your help today, Luna. It must be hard working in retail, but at least you get commission, right? You must be really happy with how much we spent today." I held back a laugh and simply said, "You're absolutely right. Thank you so much for shopping with us." Just as Emma was enjoying her moment of supposed victory, a well-dressed middle-aged man hurried into the store. "Boss, has my color TV arrived yet?" he called out to me. Emma's triumphant smile froze on her face as she realized what he'd said. She stared at me in shock, but I just smiled back pleasantly and turned to the man. "Mr. Lee, I've been keeping it safe for you. Please follow me." By the time I came back from showing Mr. Lee his TV in the warehouse, Emma and Ryan had disappeared. Later that night, after I finished counting the day's earnings and going over the books with my employees, I locked up the store. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but smile at how differently things had turned out from what Emma had imagined. The quiet street stretched out before me, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I had built something real while others had been busy putting on shows. The night air was cool as I walked down the quiet street. My heart jumped when I heard footsteps behind me, and I quickly reached for the pepper spray in my purse. But then a voice I hadn't heard in 2 years called out my name. "Luna, wait!" It was Ryan. Instead of running away, I found myself following him to a small street food stall nearby. The smell of cooking noodles and the noise of people eating and talking filled the air. It felt strangely normal, sitting there with him after so long. Looking at Ryan now, it was hard to believe we had once been so close. In the 2 years since he'd been gone, I had barely thought about him at all. I had been too busy working hard, saving money, and planning my future. My life had moved forward, and his face had slowly faded from my memory. Now, here he was, sitting across from me, looking exactly the same but somehow completely different. We sat in uncomfortable silence for what felt like forever. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten dinner yet. I picked up my chopsticks and started eating the noodles, trying to ignore how Ryan was watching me. Finally, he broke the silence. "Luna, how have you been?" he asked softly. I nodded while chewing, then answered simply, "Very well." And it wasn't a lie. After leaving Ryan behind, my life had gotten so much better. Ryan's face changed as he looked at me, like he was carrying a heavy weight. "Luna, I need to apologize," he said, his voice shaking slightly. I stopped eating, surprised that he actually understood he had done something wrong. His face turned white as he continued talking. He explained how he knew I had left because he hadn't ended things with Emma, even though we were engaged. Instead, he had kept taking care of her, and somehow she had started telling everyone that they were together. I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous it all was. "You kept calling her your sister for years, even though you weren't really related," I said. "No wonder she thought she could claim you as her own." Ryan looked upset, but he kept talking anyway. He told me how Emma's family had caused all sorts of problems, demanding that he marry her even though she already had a child from someone else. His mother had been completely against it, and Emma's family had started showing up at both his and his mother's workplaces to make scenes. "Stop," I said firmly, holding up my hand. I really don't want to hear any more about this. I put down my chopsticks and pushed my bowl away. You're married now, aren't you? It's not right for you to be telling me all of this. I pulled out $100 bill, handed it to the food vendor, and stood up to leave. As I walked away, I didn't look back at Ryan even once. I knew all about Emma's family and their reputation in our neighborhood. Everyone knew what they were like. They were famous for causing trouble and drama wherever they went. They would latch onto anyone they thought could give them money or status, like leeches that wouldn't let go until they had taken everything they could get. Walking home alone, I felt grateful that I had managed to escape that whole situation before it could drag me down too. Sarah's wedding was far from traditional. Her family eagerly accepted the money from Mark's family, but they didn't give her any of the usual wedding gifts or items for her new home. This made Mark's family look down on her from the start. They saw her as someone from a poor background who wasn't good enough for their son. It wasn't surprising when things started falling apart, and Sarah ended up moving back in with her parents just months after the wedding. I had warned Mark about Sarah and her family many times before the wedding, but he was so in love that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. Every time I pointed out something concerning, he would make excuses for her behavior or find ways to justify it. Love truly had made him blind to all the red flags that were so clear to everyone else. Now, with Sarah's entire family constantly asking him for money and favors, Mark finally understood what a difficult situation he was in. He started visiting me more often, usually looking troubled and lost. During these visits, he would sit quietly, obviously wanting to say something important, but never finding the courage to speak up. After several of these awkward meetings, I decided to take matters into my own hands and invited Sarah to come over while Mark was there. Looking directly at Mark, I finally asked him the question that had been hanging in the air. "What do you really want from me?" He stayed quiet for what felt like forever, staring at the floor. Finally, he raised his head and looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Jessica," he said softly, "do you think we could try again? Could we have another chance?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at his question. "Are you serious right now? You're a married man, Mark. Are you really trying to get back together with me while you're still married?" He jumped up from his chair, looking upset. "I never wanted to marry her. My family pushed me into it. I can get a divorce. She's just a divorced woman with a kid anyway. Do you think I would have chosen her if she hadn't been so desperate to marry me? Everyone makes fun of me now, saying I'm raising another man's child. They say I gave up something valuable to pick up something nobody else wanted." Before he could say anything else, we heard a loud scream from the hallway. Sarah burst into the room, her face red with anger. "I'll kill you, you horrible man!" she screamed, running toward Mark with her hands reaching for his throat. "What's wrong with my child? Is he taking anything from you? You call me unwanted? Look at yourself. You're nothing special either. And don't act so proud. You're terrible in bed. I wish I had never married you." I watched them fighting and screaming for a moment, then quietly put on my jacket and walked out of the room. As I left, I felt grateful that I had ended things with Mark long ago. Their marriage was clearly falling apart, and they were both going to face a lot of pain and difficulty in the future. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had moved on to a better life without all that drama.